The air inside was shockingly still. After the screaming wind and the punishing ice-cold rain, the silence of the tunnel was a physical presence, a thick blanket that settled over Jonah Ezekiel Carpenter's exhausted 11-year-old body. He crawled deeper into the darkness, away from the storm-lashed entrance, his hands feeling the dry, packed earth of the floor. The chill in his bones was profound, but here, out of the wind, it was a survivable cold. 20 feet in, his searching fingers brushed against rough canvas. He pulled at it, his muscles trembling with the last of his strength, and uncovered a small cache of supplies, a miner's pickaxe, 2 thick wool blankets, and several glass jars sealed with wax. He didn't understand it, not yet, but he recognized salvation when he saw it. The recognition broke something inside him, and a sob tore from his throat, a raw, guttural sound of a creature that had been hunted to the edge of its life and had, against all odds, found a den. He collapsed onto the ground and wept with a relief so profound it felt like a physical weight being lifted from his soul. This is a story about a fight for survival, about the quiet legacies that protect us, and about a courage that the world had long forgotten. It's a journey that we believe is worth following until the very end. If you feel that same pull, if this opening moment has already captured your imagination, we invite you to become part of our community. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from today, and consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue to bring stories like Jonah's to life and ensures you won't miss the powerful conclusion that is to come. Your presence here makes all the difference, and we are grateful to have you with us on this path. But to understand why a forgotten mine entrance, hidden deep in the Kentucky mountainside, represented the direct and tangible answer to a desperate prayer, we must go back. We must travel back 1 week to a crisp autumn afternoon that still held the illusion of peace. It was a day before the threats became promises, before the sky turned hostile, and before a man from the Consolidation Coal Company made a calculated decision that a young boy's life was worth less than the rich vein of bituminous coal that ran like a black river directly beneath his feet. This story doesn't begin with a storm, but with the quiet, chilling greed that summoned it. Jonah Ezekiel Carpenter was 11 years old, but he carried the quiet stillness of an old man. It had been 8 months since the diphtheria had swept through their small corner of Harlan County, taking his mother first, then his father 3 weeks later, leaving Jonah in a silence so profound it felt like a constant ringing in his ears. He now lived as the sole occupant of the 2-room cabin his father had built with his own hands, a world defined by the scent of pine wood, the faint, lingering smell of his mother's lye soap, and the ever-present dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light. Each creak of the floorboards was a conversation he no longer had, each gust of wind against the glass a voice he would never hear again. His life had become a series of small necessary motions inside a structure that was no longer a home, but a monument to what he had lost. He was a ghost haunting the rooms of his own childhood, a solitary keeper of a fading world. The land itself was his only true companion. It was poor soil for farming, mostly rock and red clay, but it was his. His father's last words, rasped out in a voice already turning to dust, had not been of love or of fear, but of duty. He had pulled Jonah close, his grip surprisingly firm, and said, "A man doesn't sell the ground that holds his own." For Jonah, those words were scripture. The land was not a commodity. It was the physical manifestation of his family's history. It held the well his grandfather had dug, the small plot where his parents were buried under 2 simple wooden crosses, and the ancient oak tree from which his own childhood swing had once hung. To sell it would be to sell their graves, to sell their memory, to sell the very last piece of them that the world had not yet taken from him. It was an impossible, unthinkable betrayal. His days were governed by a rhythm of survival that left little room for grief. He rose with the sun, his small frame moving with a practiced efficiency that belied his age. He would fetch water from the creek, the cold shocking his hands awake. He would check his snares, hoping for a rabbit or a squirrel, and tend to the small, stubborn garden that yielded more stones than vegetables. He learned to mend his own clothes with clumsy, oversized stitches and to cook thin cornmeal mush over the hearth. These tasks were a shield. As long as his hands were busy, as long as his mind was focused on the next immediate need, firewood, water, food. He could keep the larger, more terrifying realities at bay. The crushing weight of his solitude, the fear of the coming winter, the gnawing uncertainty of his future, all of it was held back by the simple, repetitive work of staying alive one more day. The world beyond his property line was changing. The Consolidation Coal Company had moved into the valley 2 years prior, and its presence was a slow, creeping infection. The distant, rhythmic clang of hammers and the low rumble of machinery were now a permanent part of the mountain's soundscape, a constant reminder of the industrial giant that was devouring the land piece by piece. Sometimes, on a clear day, he could see a plume of black smoke rising from beyond the far ridge, a smudge against the clean blue sky that felt like a personal offense. He heard stories in the rare times he went to the settlement for salt or flour, whispers of families forced out, of land deeds acquired through threats and intimidation. The company was a faceless beast, a hungry entity with an insatiable appetite for the black rock that slept beneath the mountains, and Jonah knew, with the unshakable certainty of a threatened animal, that its gaze was slowly turning toward him. The beast was given a face in the form of Virgil Sloan. He was a man in his 40s, with a soft body that spoke of a life spent indoors and a pair of cold, calculating eyes that missed nothing. Sloan began his visits in late summer, arriving on a horse that looked as tired and cynical as he did. His initial offers for the land were wrapped in a cloying, false pity for the poor orphan boy. He spoke of the city, of schools, of a better life, but his words were hollow, his smile never reaching his eyes. Jonah would listen silently from the porch steps, his father's rifle resting across his lap. And when Sloan was finished, he would give the same simple, unadorned answer: "It's not for sale." He didn't explain his reasons. He felt no need to justify his loyalty to a man who saw the land, not as a home, but as a number on a ledger. With each visit, Sloan's facade of compassion grew thinner, cracking to reveal the raw impatience beneath. The offers increased, but the tone became sharper, laced with a condescending frustration that was more honest than his earlier pity. He stopped talking about a better life for Jonah and started talking about the inevitability of progress, the foolishness of one boy standing in the way of industry. During his last visit before the ultimatum, Sloan had stared at the small hand-hewn cabin with open contempt, his gaze lingering on the sagging porch and the patched roof. "This place is a ruin," he had sneered. "You're living in a grave and you're too stubborn to see it." The words were meant to wound, to break the boy's spirit, but they did the opposite. They solidified Jonah's resolve, transforming his quiet grief into a hard, defiant anger. At night the fear was a living thing. It would creep in with the shadows, whispering doubts into the silence of the cabin. He would lie on his straw-stuffed mattress, staring into the darkness, and wonder if he was a fool. He was just a boy, small and alone, against men with money and power. He would think of his father's face, trying to remember the exact shade of his eyes, the sound of his laugh, and he would ask him silently if he was doing the right thing. Was this what he wanted? For his only son to live this hard, lonely life, to stand against a tide that would surely drown him? The answers never came, of course, but the act of asking, of keeping that internal conversation alive, was a comfort. It was a reminder that he was not just fighting for a piece of dirt, but for a connection, for the last echo of his father's voice. Despite the encroaching darkness, there were still moments of grace. There was a quiet beauty in the way the morning mist settled in the hollows, making the world seem soft and new. There was a simple, profound pleasure in the taste of a wild blackberry, its sweetness bursting on his tongue. He knew the names of the trees and the calls of the birds. He could read the weather in the clouds and the changing of the seasons in the scent of the air. This was a language he understood, a world in which he belonged. Virgil Sloan and his company were the intruders, the ones who spoke a foreign tongue of profit and progress. These small, fleeting moments of peace were a constant affirmation. They were the very things he was fighting to protect, the quiet, sacred life that the coal company could never understand, and would, if given the chance, utterly destroy without a second thought. The first tangible sign of the escalating conflict appeared one morning in early October. He found a small, sharpened wooden stake driven into the ground not 50 yards from his front porch, a thin red ribbon tied to its top. It was a survey marker. A line had been drawn. The company was no longer asking. It was measuring, planning, preparing to take what he would not sell. A cold dread settled in his stomach. The threat was no longer a distant rumble or a man's angry words. It was here on his land, a silent declaration of war. He felt a primal sense of being watched, as if unseen eyes were studying him from the dense woods that bordered his property, judging his weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The mountain no longer felt entirely safe. This new, immediate danger did not cause him to reconsider. Instead, it clarified his purpose. He remembered his father telling him stories of his own grandfather, a man who had dug for coal with his bare hands, a man who believed that integrity was the only possession that could not be stolen. Jonah saw this fight as a continuation of their legacy. It was a test of the principles they had instilled in him. To run, to surrender, would be to admit that their lives, their beliefs, and their sacrifices meant nothing. He was a carpenter, and the men in his family did not break. He took the small axe from the woodpile and, with a defiant swing, smashed the survey marker into splinters, a small symbolic act of resistance against an overwhelming force. The air grew colder. The vibrant colors of autumn began to fade, replaced by the stark skeletal gray of the approaching winter. A deep sense of foreboding settled over the small cabin, a palpable tension that seemed to charge the very air he breathed. Jonah spent his days reinforcing the cabin, chinking the walls with fresh mud and straw, stockpiling firewood as if preparing for a long siege. He knew Sloan would be back. He knew the smashed survey marker would be seen not as a boy's defiance, but as a final, unforgivable insult. He did not know what form the company's retribution would take, but he felt it coming, like the drop in pressure before a violent storm. The quiet, lonely peace of his mountain was about to be shattered forever. The ultimatum arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, carried not on the back of a tired horse but by Virgil Sloan himself, who walked the final quarter mile to the cabin with a purpose that felt different from all his previous visits. There was no pretense of negotiation in his stride, no false pity in his eyes. The air around him seemed colder, stripped of the usual layers of condescending charm. He approached the porch where Jonah stood, his small frame a silent question mark against the backdrop of his home, and stopped at the bottom step. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply looked at the boy, then at the cabin, his gaze sweeping over it with an appraising, final contempt. The mask of the patient land agent had been discarded somewhere down the trail, and what stood before Jonah now was the unadorned, unapologetic face of corporate will, a force as impersonal and as powerful as a rock slide. It was the face of a man who had come not to bargain, but to conclude. Sloan did not waste time with hollow pleasantries or inflated offers. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded document and a small stack of bills, holding them out not as an invitation, but as a final perfunctory gesture. He named the price, $20. The sum was so small, so dismissive, it was a calculated insult, a clear statement that this was no longer a transaction between two parties, but a final chance to accept a pittance before the inevitable. He was offering Jonah the price of a cheap suit for his entire world, for the ground that held his parents' bones. Jonah looked from the money to Sloan's face, and the defiant anger that had been simmering within him for weeks hardened into a quiet, unshakable resolve. He shook his head once, a small, firm gesture, and uttered the same words he always had, though this time they felt heavier, like the closing of a door. "It's not for sale." The refusal hung in the air for a moment, and then Sloan's face changed. The last vestige of civility evaporated, collapsing inward to reveal something cold and reptilian. He slowly retracted his hand, folding the money and the deed back into his pocket with a chilling deliberation. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and devoid of any emotion, except a flat, chilling certainty. He told Jonah about the storm front moving in from the west, describing it not as a possibility, but as a meteorological fact. He spoke of its projected path, its predicted force, and the exact time it was expected to hit their part of the mountain. He laid out the future, as if reading from a ledger, connecting the wind and the rain directly to the boy's defiance. This was no longer about land or money. It was about a lesson in power, a promise that nature itself would be weaponized to break him. Jonah felt the man's words like a physical chill, a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He stood rooted to the porch, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides, the weight of his powerlessness pressing down on him. He was a child, alone, facing a man who was willing to see him dead from exposure, rather than suffer a delay in profit. In that moment, he understood the vast, impersonal cruelty of the world, beyond his small patch of land. It was a world where a boy's life could be measured against a vein of coal and be found wanting. The fear was a living thing in his chest, a frantic bird beating its wings against his ribs, but beneath it his father's words were an anchor. A man doesn't sell the ground that holds his own. He did not flinch or look away. He simply met Sloane's cold gaze, his silence a final act of defiance. Sloan left without another word, his departure as abrupt and ominous as his arrival. The next 2 days were a slow, agonizing torment. Jonah existed in a state of suspended dread, the world around him transformed by the threat. Every gust of wind felt like a prelude, every dark cloud on the horizon a harbinger of the promised storm. The familiar sounds of the mountain, the rustle of leaves and the call of a distant hawk, now seemed to mock him with their indifference. He tried to continue his daily routines, fetching water and checking his snares, but the simple tasks felt meaningless, like the motions of a condemned man on his final day. He was living inside a threat, breathing it in, feeling it settle over his home like a shroud. The cabin, once his fortress, now felt fragile and exposed, a temporary shelter on borrowed time. The men returned 3 nights later, long after the sun had dipped below the ridge, and the world had been swallowed by a deep, moonless dark. Jonah heard them first. The unnatural crack of a twig under a heavy boot, the low murmur of voices that did not belong to the night. A primal instinct, sharp and immediate, sent him scrambling for cover. He grabbed his father's rifle, a cold and useless comfort, and slipped out the back of the cabin, melting into the dense dark green tangle of a rhododendron thicket. From his hiding place, he watched, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, as 3 figures emerged from the tree line. It was Sloan, and with him were 2 large, silent men who moved with a brutal economy of motion. They were not carrying papers or money. They were carrying tools and a ladder. He watched from the suffocating darkness of the thicket as the 2 hired men propped the ladder against the side of his home. There was a horrifying efficiency to their actions, a complete lack of hesitation that spoke of a task performed for pay, devoid of malice but also of mercy. Sloan stood back, a stationary silhouette directing the violation, his arms crossed over his chest. One of the men climbed onto the roof, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden shingles his father had so carefully laid. Then came a sound that would be seared into Jonah's memory forever. A sharp, violent crack of splitting wood, followed by the scraping sound of a shingle being ripped free from its nails. It was a sound of pure destruction, an unforgivable violence against the one place in the world he had left to call his own. The work was systematic and cruel. One by one, the men tore the shingles from the roof, tossing them to the ground below, where they landed with a clatter that echoed in the profound silence of the mountain night. Jonah remained frozen in the bushes, a powerless witness to the desecration of his home. He watched as the dark protective surface of the roof was unmade, revealing the pale wooden slats beneath, creating a gaping wound open to the sky. It was a slow, deliberate act of erasure, designed not just to expose him to the elements, but to dismantle his history, to tear apart the physical legacy of his father's labor. He felt each splintering piece of wood as a personal injury, a tearing away of his own skin, leaving him vulnerable and raw in the face of their calculated brutality. When they were finished, when a large section of the roof over the main room was completely gone, Sloan took a step forward. He did not bother to lower his voice, shouting his final promise into the darkness, certain that Jonah was hiding somewhere nearby, listening. His words cut through the night air, sharp and clear. He spoke again of the storm, promising its arrival, and then he laid out the final, terrible choice. The deed would be left on the porch. When the rain came, Jonah would either sign it for nothing, surrendering his home and his dignity, or he would die of cold, a stubborn animal succumbing to the elements. He then turned and walked away, his men following him into the woods, leaving Jonah alone in the ruins, the vast, empty and unforgiving night sky now the only ceiling above his head. For 2 days, Jonah lived inside the skeleton of his home, a prisoner under an open sky. The initial shock that had frozen him in the rhododendron thicket gave way to a hollow, aching dread. After the men had gone, he had crept back out, his small body trembling not from the cold, but from the sheer profound violation of it all. He stood in the center of the main room and looked up through the jagged hole they had carved in his world. The stars, usually a source of distant comfort, now seemed like cold, indifferent eyes staring down at his vulnerability. On the porch, the folded deed sat beneath its rock, a stark white rectangle against the weathered wood, a silent, mocking testament to the choice he had been given. It was not a choice between land and money, but between his soul and his survival, and he felt the weight of that impossible decision pressing down on him, heavier than any roof. The first night was an exercise in pure endurance. The autumn air, once crisp and invigorating, turned sharp and predatory after sundown, flowing through the new opening in the roof and settling deep into the cabin's corners, erasing any lingering warmth. Jonah huddled in the farthest corner from the hole, wrapped in his one thin blanket, but the cold was relentless. It was a physical presence, a creature that seeped through the floorboards and walls, finding its way into his bones. He lay awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the unobstructed night, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of some unseen animal in the underbrush, and felt a loneliness so complete it was almost a physical pain. This place, the only sanctuary he had ever known, had been turned into a trap, a cage designed to break him with the slow, methodical cruelty of the coming cold. He spent the next day in a state of suspended animation, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. The world seemed to have shrunk to the dimensions of his small property, and the deed on the porch was its malevolent center. He would walk to the doorway and stare at it, the paper a symbol of everything he was up against. Part of him, a small, terrified voice of pragmatism, whispered that he should just sign it. He could take the insult of the $20, walk to the settlement and disappear. He could survive. But then he would see the two simple wooden crosses on the small hillock behind the cabin, and his father's words would rise up in him solid and unyielding. "A man doesn't sell the ground that holds his own." It was not just a phrase. It was the core of his identity, the last instruction he had been given. To sign that paper would be to betray not only his father's memory, but the very essence of who he was supposed to be. As the sun began its slow descent on the second day, casting long, sorrowful shadows across the valley, a specific memory surfaced, clear and sharp as a shard of glass. He remembered a day 2 years prior, when he and his father had been caught on the high ridge by a sudden summer thunderstorm. His father had not panicked. Instead, he had found a small rock outcropping and pulled Jonah under it, shielding him with his own body from the wind and rain. As they waited, his father had pointed out at the storm-lashed mountain and spoken in a calm, steady voice. He had said that the mountain would always test a man, that it would throw wind and rain and cold at him to see what he was made of. But, he had added, for those who respected it, for those who knew its paths and its secrets, it would also provide a way through. It would always offer a shelter, a path, a chance. You just had to be willing to move your feet to find it. That memory became an anchor in the swirling chaos of his fear. It shifted his perspective, allowing him to see Sloan's plan for what it was, a psychological trap. The man had assumed Jonah was just a boy, an animal who would cower in his ruined den until the storm forced him to submit. He was expected to stay, to remain a stationary target, to let the destruction of his home lead to the destruction of his will. But his father's words echoed with new meaning. The mountain tested a man. It did not promise safety to those who sat still and waited for their fate. It offered a chance to those who moved. Suddenly the cabin was no longer his home. It was the place Sloan had chosen for him to die. The decision began to crystallize, not as a coherent plan, but as a single powerful imperative. He could not stay. He had to leave this place behind. The sky began to confirm his decision. The clear, cold blue of the afternoon was slowly being consumed by a bruised purple-gray mass that advanced from the west, swallowing the horizon. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper for 2 days, began to keen, a low, mournful sound that carried the distinct, damp smell of rain. The leaves on the ancient oak tree began to twist and turn, showing their pale undersides, an old mountain sign of a coming storm. Every element of the natural world seemed to be aligning to fulfill Sloane's prophecy. Jonah felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The period of agonizing indecision was over. The threat was no longer a future possibility. It was a present gathering force. The world was making the choice for him, pushing him out of his paralysis and toward a terrifying, unknown action. The first drop of rain fell just as dusk was settling, a single cold splash on his cheek that felt like a final summons. Then another and another. Within minutes, a steady, chilling drizzle was falling, pattering onto the dirt floor through the hole in the roof. He watched as the dry, dusty ground began to darken and soften, the water turning his home into mud. This was it. This was the moment of no return. He could no longer pretend there was a choice to be made tomorrow. The storm was here. He looked at the deed on the porch, now being speckled with raindrops, and then he looked past it, up at the dark, looming silhouette of the mountain. His father's words came to him one last time, not as a memory, but as a direct command. God answers walking feet, not sitting hands. He would not sign, and he would not die here. He would walk. His movements became swift and purposeful, driven by a surge of adrenaline that pushed back the cold and the fear. He knew he could take almost nothing. He grabbed the small canvas sack he used for gathering nuts and roots. From the pantry, he took the last of his dried corn and a small chunk of salted pork wrapped in cloth. He found his father's old tinderbox, carefully checking that the flint and steel were dry inside their oilcloth wrapping. Finally, he retrieved the small, worn clasp knife his father had given him for his 10th birthday. The items were pitifully inadequate for surviving a night on the mountain in a storm, but gathering them was an act of faith. It was a declaration that he intended to see the morning, a small, desperate claim on a future that Virgil Sloan had tried to erase. Before he left, he stood for a final moment in the center of the room, the rain now falling in a steady, determined rhythm, creating a growing puddle of mud at his feet. He let his gaze drift over the familiar shapes in the deepening gloom, the cold hearth, the empty rocking chair, the small wooden shelf that held his mother's 2 remaining porcelain teacups. This was a silent, gut-wrenching farewell. He was not just abandoning a structure. He was leaving behind the last tangible connection to his parents, the very air they had breathed, the space that had held all of his life's memories. A wave of grief so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed over him, but he held himself upright. The fear of what lay ahead on that dark, storm-swept mountain was immense, but it was the fear of the unknown. The fear of staying here was the certainty of a cold, lonely death. He chose the unknown. He walked onto the porch, the wind whipping the rain into his face. The deed was soaked now, the ink likely beginning to run, but it remained under the rock, a final, unsigned insult. He felt a brief, wild urge to tear it to shreds, to scatter it into the wind. But he resisted. Leaving it there, whole and untouched, felt like a more powerful statement. It was a testament to his refusal, a silent monument to the fact that they had failed to break him. He would not give Sloan the satisfaction of a dramatic, defiant gesture. He would simply leave the man's worthless paper behind and walk away. He was not a cornered animal. He was Jonah Ezekiel Carpenter, and he was choosing his own path, even if it led directly into the heart of the storm. With the small sack slung over his shoulder, he stepped off the porch. The mud squelched under his worn boots, and the full force of the storm hit him like a physical blow. The rain was a solid sheet of water, instantly soaking his thin shirt and trousers, and the wind tore at him, trying to push him back toward the ruined cabin. For a terrifying second he faltered, the sheer violence of the elements threatening to overwhelm his fragile resolve. But then he lifted his head, turned his back on the only home he had ever known, and faced the rising slope of the mountain. He took one step, then another, his body leaning into the wind, his feet searching for purchase on the slick, dark earth. He was walking away from his past, away from his grief, and into a night that promised nothing but a fight for his own survival. The mountain slope was not a path. It was a wall of slick black mud and tangled roots, a vertical river of earth that fought him with every step. The rain was no longer falling but being driven, a horizontal assault of ice-cold needles that stung his face and blinded his eyes. Each gust of wind was a physical blow, a massive, invisible hand that sought to tear him from his precarious hold and hurl him back down into the hollow. He moved not with grace or skill, but with the desperate, clumsy scrambling of a small animal fleeing a fire. His world had been reduced to the next few feet of ground in front of him, the rough bark of a tree to grab, the solid feel of a rock under his boot. He was no longer thinking about Virgil Sloan or the deed or the cabin. His mind was a clean, white slate of pure, unadulterated instinct. The only thought was up. The only imperative was to move. His worn leather boots, a gift from his father 2 Christmases ago, offered little purchase on the sodden ground. For every 2 steps of progress, he seemed to slide back one, his hands digging into the mud for leverage, his fingernails packing with cold, gritty soil. The darkness was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket that swallowed light and sound. He navigated by feel alone, his outstretched hands brushing against the dripping leaves of rhododendron, the sharp spines of a wild thistle, the solid trunk of an oak. He was climbing blind, trusting a sense of direction that felt increasingly fragile and unreliable. The sack on his back felt impossibly heavy, its meager contents a foolish, childish comfort against the overwhelming power of the storm. He was a tiny, insignificant creature, attempting to scale the flank of a great angry beast, and he could feel its furious breath trying to extinguish him. The sound was a constant, deafening roar. The wind shrieked through the high branches of the pines, a sound like 1,000 grieving souls, and the rain hammered against the canopy of leaves with the relentless rhythm of a war drum. It was a symphony of chaos that vibrated through the ground and into his very bones, making it impossible to think, impossible to hear his own ragged breaths. He felt utterly and completely alone, a solitary point of struggling life in a universe of violent, indifferent motion. There was no up or down, no east or west, only the punishing forward momentum of the storm and his own small, desperate struggle against it. He pressed on, his body running on a fuel of pure fear, his father's words a faint, flickering candle in the hurricane of the present moment, a fragile shield against the roaring dark. After what felt like an hour of this torturous ascent, his trembling legs began to fail him. He found a small recess beneath the exposed roots of a massive poplar tree, a shallow overhang that offered the slightest reprieve from the direct assault of the wind and rain. He huddled there, pressing his back against the cold, damp earth, his body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor that was born of both cold and exhaustion. The initial surge of adrenaline had burned away, leaving behind a deep, aching fatigue and a cold that seemed to have penetrated to the marrow of his bones. He could feel the warmth being leached from his body, a slow, insidious theft that left him feeling heavy and weak. He closed his eyes for just a second, and the temptation to stay there, to simply let the cold take him into a final, dreamless sleep, was a sweet and terrible poison. But in the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw his father's face, not as he was at the end, but as he had been on a bright summer day, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he laughed. The memory was a jolt, a spark of warmth in the encroaching ice. He remembered his father's hands, calloused and strong, and the feeling of safety they had always provided. He was his father's son. He was a carpenter. They did not sit and wait for the end. They walked. The thought, simple and clear, cut through the fog of his exhaustion. He pushed himself away from the relative comfort of the overhang, his muscles screaming in protest, and forced his numb feet to move once more. He stumbled back out into the full fury of the storm, the wind tearing at him, but his resolve, though fragile, had been rekindled. He would not die on this mountain, not tonight. His upward path was soon blocked by a natural barrier, a colossal oak that must have fallen years ago, its trunk as wide as the cabin he had just abandoned. The wood was slick with moss and rain, impossible to climb over. He was forced to move sideways, feeling his way along the length of the massive trunk, hoping to find a way around it. This lateral movement was disorienting. He lost the simple, vertical certainty of up, and now he was just moving through the darkness, unsure if he was gaining or losing elevation, Unsure if he was heading deeper into the mountains or circling back toward the hollow, a new kind of fear began to take root in his heart, a cold, creeping dread that was more terrifying than the storm itself. The fear of being hopelessly, completely lost. He was a ship without a rudder, tossed on a black, violent sea. The landscape was an anonymous enemy, every tree a potential obstacle, every dip in the ground a possible trap. He pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel, its waxy leaves slapping against his face, and emerged into a small clearing. But the brief sense of open space only amplified his feeling of being exposed and vulnerable. He stopped, turning in a slow circle, trying to get his bearings, but there were none to be had. The world was a chaotic vortex of wind, rain, and impenetrable darkness. He could have been 10 feet from his ruined home or a mile away. He had no way of knowing. The confidence that had propelled him from the cabin began to fray, replaced by the chilling realization of his own profound insignificance in the face of the wilderness. It was then that the panic, which had been held at bay by the sheer necessity of movement, finally broke through. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, and his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He leaned his forehead against the rough, wet bark of a hickory tree, and a sob, a raw, desperate sound of pure terror, was torn from his throat. The sheer hopelessness of his situation washed over him in a crushing wave. He was a boy. He was 11 years old. What was he doing on a storm-swept mountain in the middle of the night? He was going to die here, cold and alone, and no one would ever know what had happened to him. The will to move, the fragile determination that had sustained him, simply evaporated, leaving him empty and paralyzed, a small, shivering child ready to be swallowed by the night. He stayed there for a long time, clinging to the tree as if it were the last solid thing in the universe, the storm raging around him and the storm raging within him. He thought of his mother, of the way she used to hum a quiet tune while she worked, a sound that had always made the small cabin feel safe and warm. He thought of her hands, gentle and kind. And then he thought of Virgil Sloan's face, the cold, reptilian certainty in his eyes. And something shifted. The image of Sloan's smug, cruel face ignited a tiny, hard spark of defiance in the cold ashes of his despair. He would not give that man the satisfaction. He would not be the stubborn animal who died of cold. He would not. He took a single, shuddering breath, then another. He pushed himself away from the tree. He would not think about the entire mountain. He would only think about taking one more step. The next phase of his journey was a blur of mechanical motion, his body acting on some deep, primal instinct for survival that bypassed conscious thought. He no longer felt the cold as a sharp sting, but as a dull, heavy weight that infused his entire body. His feet were numb, his hands raw and bleeding from countless scrapes against rock and bark. He moved slowly, deliberately, his mind focused on the simple, repetitive action of placing one foot in front of the other. He navigated a steep, rocky section, his hands and knees scraping against the sharp edges of the stone, his breath coming in ragged, painful bursts. He was an automaton, a small machine built for the sole purpose of moving forward, driven by the last flickering embers of a promise made to the ghost of his father. The world was pain and motion, and nothing else. He was crossing a section of ground covered in a thick mat of wet, fallen leaves, a treacherous carpet that hid the uneven terrain beneath. His focus had narrowed to a tiny point, his awareness of his surroundings almost completely gone, when his right foot, searching for purchase, snagged on something hard and unyielding hidden beneath the leafy debris. It was an exposed tree root, thick as his arm. The sudden, violent stop of his forward momentum sent him pitching forward. There was no time to react, no chance to catch himself. One moment he was on his feet, the next he was airborne, tumbling head over heels into the black, empty space of a steep, unseen embankment. The world dissolved into a chaotic, spinning nightmare of sensation. The fall was a brutal, jarring symphony of violence. He felt the sharp impact of rocks against his back and ribs, the lashing of branches against his face, the sickening, weightless lurch of his stomach as he tumbled through the darkness. He was a rag doll, thrown down a flight of stone stairs, completely helpless, his body a collection of limbs being battered and twisted by the unforgiving terrain. The small sack was ripped from his shoulder, its meager contents scattered into the storm. He tried to cry out, but the air was knocked from his lungs by a hard impact that sent a starburst of white-hot pain through his chest. He was spinning, falling, lost in a world of pure physical agony, with no sense of when or how it would end. The mountain was finally breaking him, piece by painful piece. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. His descent was stopped by a final jarring impact that felt different from the others. It wasn't the sharp crack of a rock or the splintering give of a branch. It was a flat, solid thud against something unyielding and strangely uniform, a force that seemed to hit his entire body at once. The impact knocked the last of the air from his lungs, and he lay there dazed and gasping, his body a constellation of deep, throbbing aches. The rain continued to pour down on him, and the wind howled above, but down here at the bottom of the embankment, it seemed slightly less ferocious. He was alive, bruised, battered and utterly spent, but he was alive. He lay still for a full minute, letting the world slowly come back into focus, letting the pain consolidate into specific points of agony in his shoulder, his hip, and his ribs. He pushed himself up slowly, his muscles screaming in protest, and a wave of dizziness washed over him. He braced himself with a hand against the surface that had stopped his fall. It was cold and slick with a thick carpet of wet moss, but beneath it he could feel the unmistakable grain of wood. It was flat and rectangular. He ran his numb fingers over it, trying to comprehend what he was touching. In the middle of a wild, rocky mountainside, hidden at the bottom of a dark ravine, he had fallen against something that had been built. He had fallen against a door. For a long moment, Jonah simply lay against the door, the solid wood a strange and impossible anchor in the swirling chaos of the night. His mind, battered and bruised like the rest of his body, struggled to process the information his fingers were sending it. A door. Not a rock, not a fallen tree, but a man-made rectangular wooden door set directly into the mountainside, hidden beneath a thick living blanket of moss and earth. It was a detail so absurd, so out of place in the wild, untamed landscape, that it felt like a hallucination, born of exhaustion and pain. But it was real. He pushed himself onto his knees, his entire body a symphony of sharp, protesting aches, and felt for a handle, a latch, anything. There was nothing, just swollen, seamless wood, a surge of desperate strength. The last reserve of his will to live propelled him to find a loose, heavy rock. He hammered it against the frame, the dull, thudding sound swallowed by the storm, until a section of rotted wood splintered and gave way. He clawed at the opening, his fingers raw, and finally forced the heavy door inward with a groan of ancient, reluctant hinges. The change was instantaneous and absolute. The moment he crawled through the dark, narrow opening, the world was transformed. The screaming, punishing wind was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it was almost a physical presence. The driving, ice-cold rain vanished, and the air that greeted him was shockingly still, cool but not frigid, carrying the dry mineral scent of deep earth. The roar of the storm was still there, but it was now a distant, muted rumble, the sound of a caged beast heard from a place of safety. It was the most profound sensory shift of his life, a transition from a world of total violence to one of absolute calm. He was out of the storm. The simple, unbelievable truth of it was too vast for his tired mind to fully grasp, but his body understood. He had found a haven, a small pocket of peace carved into the heart of the mountain's fury, and he was for the moment safe. He scrambled deeper into the darkness, driven by a primal need to put as much solid rock as possible between himself and the world that had tried to kill him. His hands and knees moved over a floor of dry, packed earth, a welcome, stable surface after the slick, treacherous mud of the slope. The darkness was complete, a pure, unadulterated black that felt less like an absence of light and more like a thick velvet curtain. It was not the threatening, disorienting darkness of the forest, but a protective, womb-like blackness that promised shelter and obscurity. He kept moving forward, his breath coming in ragged, shuddering gasps, until the muted sound of the storm was barely an echo, a distant memory of a battle he had somehow impossibly survived. He was in the belly of the mountain, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he could stop moving. The cessation of struggle was a physical shock. He slumped against one of the tunnel walls, the cool, rough-hewn stone a steady and reassuring presence against his back. The violent, uncontrollable shivering that had racked his body for the last hour began to subside, replaced by a deep, bone-weary tremor of profound exhaustion. Every muscle ached, every bruise throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, but the immediate, life-threatening cold was beginning to recede. The constant subterranean temperature of the tunnel was slowly, patiently leaching the ice from his marrow, offering a promise of warmth that was more precious than food or water. He closed his eyes, his head slumping forward onto his chest, and for a full minute he did nothing but breathe in the still, dry air, letting the reality of his survival sink into his exhausted cells. He was alive. He had made it through. After a time, a flicker of awareness returned, a need to understand the nature of this impossible sanctuary. He pushed himself away from the wall and began to explore his surroundings, not with his eyes, which were useless in the absolute dark, but with his hands. He shuffled forward slowly, his arms outstretched, his fingers brushing against the rough, chiseled walls of the narrow passage. It was clearly a mine tunnel, small and crudely dug, but stable. The air was fresh, suggesting a ventilation shaft somewhere deeper in. He felt a sense of purpose, of agency, return to him. He was not just a victim of the storm, he was an explorer in a new and mysterious domain. This place was not a grave. It was a refuge, and he needed to know its secrets, to understand the miracle that had saved him. He had moved perhaps 20 feet from the entrance, when his searching left hand brushed against something that did not belong. It was not the cold, hard texture of rock or the soft grit of earth. It was the coarse, stiff feel of heavy fabric. He stopped, his heart giving a sudden hard thump against his ribs. He knelt, his hands moving over the object with a new sense of urgency and a prickle of fear. It was a large sheet of canvas, heavy and thick, covering a bundled shape in the corner of the tunnel. A wave of questions flooded his mind. Who had left this here? When? Were they coming back? For a terrifying moment he wondered if he had stumbled into someone else's den, if he was an intruder in a place that belonged to another. His hand hesitated, hovering over the edge of the canvas, torn between the desperate need to know and the fear of what he might find. He took a deep, shuddering breath and made his choice. His fingers, clumsy with cold and exhaustion, found a corner of the heavy fabric and began to pull. The canvas was stiff, possibly waxed, and it resisted his efforts, but he persisted, driven by a curiosity that was now more powerful than his fear. He worked his fingers under the edge, and with a final, desperate tug that sent a sharp pain through his bruised shoulder, he pulled the cover back. In the impenetrable darkness he could see nothing, but his questing hands immediately found the objects hidden beneath. He felt the unmistakable shape of a wooden handle, long and smooth, connected to the cold, heavy iron of a pickaxe head. Beside it, his fingers brushed against the soft, thick pile of wool, folded into a dense, heavy square. And next to that, his hand closed around the cool, smooth glass of a large sealed jar. It was in that moment that the full, staggering truth of his situation descended upon him. This was not an accident. This was not a random, forgotten tunnel. The pickaxe, the 2 thick wool blankets, the several glass jars sealed with wax. This was a cache of supplies. This was a prepared shelter. Someone, at some point in the distant past, had deliberately placed these items here, creating a hidden, self-contained world of survival deep within the mountain. It was not a miracle from a distant, unseeable God. It was a tangible, physical act of foresight and care. It was a legacy left by an unknown hand, a message across time that said, "Survive." The recognition was not a thought, but a physical blow, a wave of understanding so powerful it took his breath away and buckled his knees. This recognition broke something deep inside him, releasing the tide of terror and grief and pain that he had held back for so long. A sob, a raw, guttural sound that seemed to be torn from the very center of his being, ripped through the profound silence of the tunnel. It was the sound of a creature that had been hunted to the absolute edge of its life and had, against all odds, stumbled into a den that had been waiting for it all along. He collapsed onto the packed earth floor, the blankets and jars forgotten, and wept. He cried with a relief so profound, so all-consuming that it felt like a physical weight being lifted from his soul, as if the hands of the storm themselves were finally releasing their grip. He was a boy, alone in the dark. But for the first time since his parents had died, he was not entirely without protection. He was safe, and in the heart of the mountain, he cried for the salvation he could not yet understand. For days, Jonah lived by the rhythm of the deep earth. The storm raged and then blew itself out, but he remained in the quiet, cool dark of the mine, a world away from the wind and the rain. He slept wrapped in the thick wool blankets, the scent of lanolin and dust a strange, primitive comfort. The first time he managed to pry open one of the wax-sealed jars, he found it filled to the brim with hard, dry pinto beans. It was simple, unadorned sustenance, but to him it was a feast. He ate them raw at first, the small hard beans a chalky presence in his mouth, but they were food. They were life. This small tunnel was not a prison, but a womb, a place where he was being kept safe, nurtured by provisions he could not yet understand. He moved with a quiet reverence, touching the chiseled stone walls, feeling the solidness of the mountain around him, and a strange sense of belonging began to take root in his exhausted soul. His exploration was cautious and methodical. The tunnel was short, no more than 50 feet deep, ending in a solid wall of rock where the digger had apparently given up. There was a small secondary passage, barely wide enough for his small body to squeeze through, that angled upward. He followed it, discovering that it led to a narrow ventilation shaft, a fissure in the rock that opened to the outside world high on the mountainside, cleverly hidden by a dense thicket of mountain laurel. Through this small opening, he could see the sky, breathe the clean, rain-washed air, and watch the world without being seen. It was a perfect hiding place, a self-contained world with its own window to the outside. The foresight it must have taken to not only dig this tunnel, but to ensure it had a safe source of air was staggering. It spoke of a mind that understood not just hard work, but survival. The true nature of his salvation was not revealed to him in a single blinding flash, but in a series of small, quiet discoveries that slowly pieced together a story that stretched back across a generation. He was examining the miner's pickaxe, its wooden handle worn smooth with use, its iron head still sharp despite a fine layer of rust. He ran his thumb over the base of the handle, feeling for splinters, and his finger caught on a small, deliberate irregularity in the wood. He looked closer, using the faint light from the air shaft to see. There, crudely but clearly carved into the wood, were two initials, J.C., his own initials, Jonah Carpenter. For a heart-stopping moment, he felt a dizzying sense of unreality, as if this place had been prepared specifically for him. But that was impossible. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that no one alive knew he was here. The initials stayed with him, a persistent, unsolvable riddle. His father's name had been John, so it could have been his. John Carpenter. But his father had been a farmer and a carpenter of wood, not a miner. He had spoken of the mines with a deep and abiding distrust, a place that had taken too many good men. As Jonah methodically worked his way through the supplies, he made his next discovery. At the bottom of a jar of dried corn, his fingers brushed against something small, hard, and wrapped in oilcloth. He carefully fished it out, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. He unwrapped the cloth, its surface still faintly slick with protective oil, to reveal a small tarnished silver locket, the kind a man might carry in his pocket. It was plain, unadorned, and heavy for its size. The latch was stiff, and he had to work at it with the tip of his knife, his hands trembling slightly. When it finally sprang open, he did not find a miniature portrait of a forgotten wife or child. Instead, tucked into the tiny space was a minuscule, tightly folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. He carefully unfolded it, his breath held tight in his chest. The paper was fragile, almost translucent, and on it, written in a faded brown ink that was now barely legible, were 4 simple words. It was not a long letter or a detailed explanation. It was a prayer, a hope, a legacy, all contained in a single powerful phrase. He had to hold it directly under the light of the air shaft to make it out, his eyes straining to decipher the old looping script. The words read, "For my boy, be safe." And beneath them the same 2 initials that were carved into the pickaxe handle, J.C. The full weight of understanding crashed down on him in that moment, a wave of realization so profound it felt like a physical blow. J.C., not Jonah Carpenter, not John Carpenter, Jedediah Carpenter, his grandfather, a man he had never met, a man who had died in a mine collapse a quarter of a century ago. This place, these supplies, this message, they weren't for him. They had been left here by his grandfather, Jedediah, for his own son, John. This was a father's desperate attempt to provide a safe harbor for his own child in a dangerous world. It was a cache meant for the boy who would grow up to be Jonah's own father. The thought was staggering. He was living on the echoes of a love that was a generation old, saved by a man's care for a son who had never needed it, but whose own son now did. He sank to the floor of the tunnel, the small piece of paper clutched in his hand, and the tears that came were not of relief or fear, but of a deep, soul-shaking gratitude. He was not the recipient of a random miracle or a stroke of blind luck. He was the inheritor of a legacy of love. His grandfather, a faceless name from a family story, had reached across 25 years of silence and death to save him. He had not been abandoned. He had not been forgotten. In the darkest, most terrifying moment of his life, when the world had tried its best to erase him, the hand of his own family had been there waiting in the dark, offering him shelter, warmth, and a future. He was not alone in this tunnel. He was surrounded by the quiet, powerful presence of his grandfather's foresight and his father's love. He sat there for a long time, the silence of the mine a sacred space around him. He thought of his own father, of his final words, "A man doesn't sell the ground that holds his own." He understood now, with a clarity that was both heartbreaking and beautiful, that his father had not just been talking about the land itself. He was talking about this, about the history buried within it, the love and sacrifice that had consecrated it. This mountain held not just his parents' graves, but his grandfather's love, a tangible, life-saving force that had been waiting patiently in the dark. Virgil Sloan had seen only a worthless plot of dirt covering a vein of coal. He could never have understood that he was trying to buy a family's soul, a place protected by the ghosts of good men. The discovery changed everything. The supplies were no longer just objects, they were gifts. The blankets were an embrace from a man he'd never met. The beans and corn were a meal provided by a long-dead hand. The pickaxe was a tool of survival, but also a symbol of the strength that ran in his blood. He was a carpenter, and the men in his family built things to last. His grandfather had built this sanctuary. His father had built their home, and now it was his turn to build a life from the ruins of his past, to using the tools that his ancestors had left for him. He was not just a survivor, he was the keeper of a legacy, the final living link in a chain of quiet, resilient men. He carefully refolded the tiny piece of paper and placed it back inside the locket. He closed it, the soft click of the latch echoing in the stillness. He did not put it in his pocket. Instead, he found a piece of twine in the supplies and looped it through the locket's ring, hanging it around his own neck. The cool, heavy weight of the silver against his skin was a constant physical reminder. It was a promise to his grandfather that his foresight would not be in vain, a promise to his father that the ground would be kept, a promise to himself that he would live. He was no longer just a scared, orphaned boy hiding from a storm. He was Jonah Ezekiel Carpenter, the grandson of Jedediah, and he had work to do. The next 2 years were a period of profound and silent transformation. Jonah lived within the mountain, the mine tunnel, his home, his school, and his fortress. He emerged only when necessary, moving like a shadow through the woods, using the hunting skills his father had taught him to supplement the dried goods his grandfather had left him. He learned the rhythms of the seasons from inside the earth, feeling the subtle shifts in temperature, listening to the changing sounds of the world that filtered down through the air shaft. He grew taller, his body hardening from the constant work of survival, his face losing its childish roundness and taking on the lean, angular lines of his father's. The solitude did not break him, it forged him. He became as quiet, as patient, and as resilient as the mountain that sheltered him. Using his grandfather's pickaxe, he began to work, not just to pass the time, but with a deep, instinctual purpose. He widened the main tunnel, and carefully, painstakingly, began to follow the thin coal seam his grandfather had first discovered. It was grueling, exhausting work. his days filled with the rhythmic scrape and clang of iron against rock. But it was his. It was a conversation with the man who had saved him, a continuation of the work Jedediah had started. And it was during this slow, patient exploration that he made his second world-altering discovery. He broke through a thin wall of shale and heard something that did not belong in his silent world. The distant, rhythmic tap of other pickaxes and the low murmur of men's voices. The Consolidation Coal Company had found his family's coal, and they were stealing it from the other side of the mountain. The anger he felt was cold, hard, and patient. For months he did not act. He watched. He listened. He used his small size to navigate the intersecting tunnels, a ghost in the machine mapping their progress, noting their illegal trespass onto his family's property. He sketched their operations onto pieces of flattened bark with bits of charcoal, creating a detailed, undeniable record of their theft. This was no longer just about a ruined cabin or a $20 insult. It was a war for his birthright, and he was gathering the intelligence he needed to fight it. He was no longer a victim. He was a strategist, a silent observer waiting for the right moment to bring the weight of the truth down upon the men who thought he was dead and gone. When he was 13, he knew it was time. He took his maps, the locket around his neck, and his father's final instructions in his heart, and he walked out of the mountains. He found the traveling Methodist preacher his father had spoken of with such respect, a man named Josiah Whitmore. In a dusty church office, the boy who had been a ghost for 2 years laid out his story, his voice quiet but unshakable, his bark maps the clear and damning evidence of a massive corporate crime. Reverend Whitmore saw not a wild mountain boy, but a vessel of profound and righteous conviction. He saw the truth in Jonah's eyes, and he acted. The lawsuit that followed shook Harlan County, exposing the company's greed and Virgil Sloan's brutal, calculated cruelty. The victory was absolute. Sloan was arrested, the company settled, and Jonah, the boy they had left for dead, was suddenly the legal and rightful owner of his family's land, his future secured by a sum of money that was, to him, almost beyond comprehension. But the greater victory was the family he found. Reverend Whitmore and his wife, a kind, childless couple, saw in Jonah not a project, but a son. They officially adopted him, giving him the home and the love he had lost, mending the profound loneliness that 2 years in the mountain had not been able to erase. They gave him a foundation of warmth and stability from which he could finally begin to heal and to build. He did not abandon the mountain. He did not run from the memories. With the settlement money, he built a new house, strong and true, on the exact spot where his father's cabin had stood. He hired men from the valley, men who had been exploited by the big companies, and paid them a fair wage to work the coal seam his grandfather had found, forming a small, independent cooperative. He stood on the porch of his new home, the silver locket a familiar weight against his chest, and looked out at the land that was his. It was not just a piece of ground. It was a testament to the quiet, enduring strength of family, to the love that echoes across generations, and to the unshakable truth that a man, or even a boy, who stands on the ground that holds his own, is standing on the firmest place on earth.